Hi there, and welcome to the module on human trafficking. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what human trafficking is and how we can be on the lookout for it at LifePlan. This is something that we really need to be aware of, because especially as we move more into the area of sexually transmitted testing and treatment, we are going to possibly run into cases of people who have been victims of human trafficking. So it's good to know what human trafficking is, what some of the signs are to look for, and then how we can respond when we're in that situation. Before we start, I want to read a verse from Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1. It says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release for the prisoners." And I want to keep that verse in mind as we speak, because one of the things that Jesus came to do was to set the captives free. And we also want to help set captives free. And ultimately, we want to set them free from the things that are happening to them in their lives, the captivity of human trafficking, but ultimately we want to set them free from sin and have them come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. That's what everything is about at LifePlan. So keep that in mind as we go over some stuff about human trafficking. So what is human trafficking? There's human trafficking, sex trafficking, and then there's slavery. We're going to talk specifically about sex trafficking because that's what relates mostly to what we do at LifePlan. Sex trafficking, the definition of it is when a person is made to perform a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, or a person performing a commercial sex act is under the age of 18. So anytime you have a person under the age of 18 who is performing that commercial sex act, something that's going to be sold, there's money, things taking place, exchange taking place for that, that is automatically sex trafficking. It includes the following: prostitution of a minor by a trafficker or a pimp. Pimp is pretty much the term that we use for a trafficker. Purchase of a minor for commercial sex acts by a buyer. Prostitution of a minor by a family member. Prostitution of a minor by a gang or gang members. Street prostitution, escort services, or internet facilitated prostitution. Or pornography, where the person sold, rented is provided something of value to perform the sexual acts on camera or video. In fact, pornography actually fuels the human trafficking industry incredibly much. The demand for pornography has people going out and getting more and more human traffickers out there having people perform these acts. It fuels each other. It's a horrible, horrible thing. In fact, we talk about this a lot at LifePlan, the triad of pornography, human trafficking, and abortion, because you've got pornography, people wanting pornography, you've got a huge audience for that, so you've got people making money off of it by human trafficking, and then when their victims get pregnant, they take them to a center where they can have an abortion, no questions asked. And so it kind of fuels it all. It's all together, it's all within what we are covering at LifePlan, so it's important stuff to know. What are some things that make a person at risk for human trafficking? So let's take a look at some of the things that make a person vulnerable to be trafficked. First of all, anybody could be trafficked. It could be happening right next door to you. It could be happening in small communities, large towns. In our area right now, it's kind of a big corridor for human trafficking because we've got I-94 that runs through, and so you've got a lot of trafficking that can take place along that, the I-94 corridor. So it's something that happens everywhere, not just in big cities. Oftentimes we think that it's just isolated to one place or in foreign countries, but it is happening here in the United States. It is happening here in Michigan, and it's probably happening in Berrien County. I'm sure it's happening in Berrien County as well. So what are some things that make a person vulnerable? First of all, there's environmental vulnerabilities, things like addictions to substances, and this includes somebody who has parents or guardians who are addicted, an unstable home life, homelessness, poor or disjointed family connections. They don't have that connection with their family. They look for it someplace else. The trafficker looks appealing to them. We'll talk about that a little later when we talk about grooming, but so they go that way. Family members or peers who are gang involved, low socioeconomic status, and identification as LGBTQ. Unfortunately, a lot of LGBTQ people are victims of human trafficking more than the straight population. System involvement. Somebody who's been involved with the juvenile justice system, often they've been arrested for lesser offenses, so they might have a juvenile justice record, and that puts them at risk. And involvement with child protective services or foster care. Again, these are children who are vulnerable, people who are vulnerable, and they're searching for that other person to love them, and this is how they feel the fulfillment of love. Intangible needs is a third thing that makes people vulnerable. For example, victims of childhood sexual abuse or other types of severe maltreatment. Someone who's already been a victim of abuse finds this kind of normal, and it also makes it very difficult for them to get out of the situation. They don't know how to respond when they find themselves in that situation. So that can lead to a vulnerability to trafficking. Chronic runaways, low self-esteem and self-worth, somebody without a very high value of themselves. Again, they're kind of getting that value from the trafficker, the trafficking. Lack of identity or poor self-concept, a desire to belong, desire or perceived need for protection. They think that the trafficker, the pimp, is protecting them. They feel like they're part of a family. And desire for material possessions. There can be a lot of money promised in trafficking, and they can have their material possessions provided for, but of course, once they get into it, they don't really have the access to the money. That's more towards the pimp, although he'll get them gifts and stuff to kind of keep them staying there for a while, but it can kind of draw them in. And once they get in, they can't get out. Here's a quote from John Richmond, who is a former Department of Justice human trafficking prosecutor. He says, "I asked a trafficker last year who he targeted. I asked him specifically if he was looking for runaways, and he laughed and told me no. He said that runaways have people looking for them. He wanted walkaways and throwaways, people that no one was looking for." So again, the most vulnerable of our population are the ones that are most at risk for human trafficking. Signs to look for, and these are things that can kind of bring a red flag if you see them, especially as you are working at LifePlan. If somebody comes in and you're doing the intake with them and you're asking them questions, we have certain questions on our forms that can help to kind of raise red flags about trafficking. Here are some things to look for. First of all, multiple abortions or pregnancies. One of the questions that we have on the form when we're doing initial intake is, how many previous pregnancies have you had? And if there's a lot or previous abortions that they've had, it's important to have this conversation. If there's a high number, it could be because of trafficking. High number of sexual partners. If you look at that and you ask how many sexual partners have you had, and there's a high number, that could also be a sign of trafficking. Early age of first sexual experience. Anytime you have an early age of first sexual experience when you're doing an intake with a client, you should follow that up with, was that consensual? Because a lot of times that early age is going to be because of abuse or because of trafficking. No identification. If there's no identification on the person, they're not carrying any identification at all, that can be a red flag, which is one reason why we ask for identification when we are seeing clients. Inconsistent story. So you're listening to their story and some things just don't quite add up or don't quite make sense. That could be a red flag. Person is accompanied by a client. The person accompanying the client seems suspicious. Monitors their activity. The person's much older, says he's a friend or family member, a translator. The client needs to ask that person permission to do things. So if you have a situation where somebody comes in, you have a client and you've got an older person with that client or somebody who just seems suspicious, then that can be something to start thinking about. That's also one of the reasons why when we're doing pregnancy tests and STI testing, we separate male and female. So we'll take the female in first without the person that came with her, so that we can kind of get a sense a little bit more and ask some questions without having that person in there. If there's a big issue with separating them, that's another thing that might raise a red flag, like maybe there's something more going on here. Also, if the client is showing distress or fear, and even distress and fear when they're separated from the person that came with them, that's another thing that could show that. Also, identifying tattoos. So tattoos can be super innocent and fun, and it's actually a great conversation starter. So if you're sitting with a client and you notice they have a bunch of tattoos, you start asking them about it. A lot of times, if there's really a good reason and an innocent reason for the tattoo, they're going to love to share it with you, like why they got it. But some of the tattoos could be branding for human trafficking. In fact, they used to put literally barcodes on their girls. So they'd also put certain things that's the brand of the trafficker. So if you see an unusual tattoo, that might be something that can start a conversation. You can ask questions about it to find out more. Now, a lot of times human trafficking victims are misidentified. Most victims don't want to tell others that they're involved in human trafficking. They often will look at it as they're a prostitute or something like that, and they won't want to say anything, or they don't see themselves as a victim. So a lot of times they'll get arrested or they'll get accused of different things, and people will start to think different things about them. Here's some common misconceptions: that the person is a prostitution, is a prostitute involved in prostitution, that they're promiscuous, that they have to be a gang member or a juvenile delinquent. Again, someone who's being trafficked could be living right next door to you, being trafficked out of their house by their uncle or grandpa. As sad as that is to say, it could be happening. They'll be a runaway. Maybe, not always. Victims are always female. That's not true. There are male victims of human trafficking as well. This only happens in other countries. Again, I said earlier, this is happening right here in Berrien County or in St. Joe County, Indiana. It's happening everywhere. The teen or the person put themselves in a dangerous situation. That is not, we don't want to get into the whole thing of blaming the victim. The teen didn't do anything except trust somebody else who was grooming that person and over a period of time to get that person ready to be trafficked. So let's talk about the grooming process real briefly here. I'm going to use a book here that is from Shared Hope International, which is a leading organization in fighting trafficking. It's called I Care, a Healthcare Provider's Guide to Recognizing and Caring for Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking Victims. And I just want to talk a little bit about the grooming process that they talk about. So what happens is you've got a trafficker or a pimp, and they're looking for the people, they're looking for the vulnerabilities, someone that they see that's vulnerable, that they can traffic, and they know really well how to spot that person. And so they actually go through a process. Sometimes the grooming process can take a year just to get the person groomed before that first trafficking experience. So they are very good at knowing what they're doing and how to groom. So what might happen is first a trafficker might be a friend on social media, or they might hang out in places such as malls or arcades, group homes, and bus stops, anywhere that provides a high potential for interacting with the vulnerable population. So they'll start hanging out at these places where they might see somebody, or they'll go online on social media and they'll start commenting on people's posts, start sending messages, things like that. The trafficker will engage a young person in conversation to assess his or her home life and life situation and to determine that person's vulnerabilities and dreams. So they'll start to really get to know the person. And you can see how this could be something that's really attractive to somebody who has that need for acceptance and a desire to belong. How that can be something that really, wow, this person's paying attention to me. They know what I want. They know what I need. And then the trafficker will target that person's vulnerabilities. They'll tell them what they need to hear. Listen to some of these things. If they want love, they'll give them love and they'll become their boyfriend. That's one thing you can see if somebody automatically or all of a sudden seems to have a much older boyfriend who's paying attention to them and buying them special gifts. That's a red flag. If they need a place to live, they'll offer them shelter. Oh, you don't have a place to live or you're not happy at home? Come stay with me. I've got a place you can stay. If they are lonely, they become their friend. They'll talk to them. They'll say things that the person needs to hear. If they don't have a loving father, they'll become their protector. So the person really feels safe with them. If they're poor or have low self-esteem, they'll sell them a dream and offer them a life of status. So they'll say, you come with me. I had this dream. This is going to happen. And you'll have the money. You'll be able to go anywhere you want to go, buy the clothes you want to buy. You don't need to worry about being poor anymore. So they find that vulnerability and they twist it. Then a trafficker will fulfill promises to earn the potential victim's trust, love, and devotion. They fill that role that we talked about. They buy the person gifts. They start getting some sort of, they appear to love the person, and that behavior, it becomes the foundation for all future psychological control. So how they started out, then, and they appear to love, and that person really starts to depend on them and feel the love, then in the future, the trafficker can say things like, don't you love me? Look at all that I've done for you. This is just something you're doing because you love me. And by that point, they're psychologically being controlled by this person. A trafficker will work to isolate the victim from all forms of positive contact or interaction with friends and family members. He strategically removes any safety net, familiar persons, and resources, gradually making the victim physically, mentally, emotionally, and financially reliant on the trafficker or pimp. So he will isolate, not right away, but eventually isolate all the forms of support that the person could have had so that the victim is entirely dependent and reliant on the trafficker, which, by the way, could be male or female. There are female traffickers as well. A trafficker will then begin demanding uncomfortable sex acts or physical interactions from the person and will punish refusal, hesitation, or complaints with physical and emotional abuse, gradually becoming more and more abusive, but the person's in there now. They'll threaten The trafficker will threaten the victim, saying, "You're not going to receive the glorious life that we promised if you don't do this." They'll attach the act of prostitution to proof of the victim's love, which I already said, if you love me, you'll do this, and impose physical or psychological abuse until gaining compliance, and then show affection. Like after the abuse, then after they do it, then show affection. "Oh, I'm so sorry I had to do that, but I had to do it. I had no choice." That type of stuff. And then a trafficker will at that point transition the victim to prostitution. And this can be violent. It can be through psychological manipulation, whatever. The victim is now in it. And to that person, there's really no getting out. They're under the control of the trafficker. And once the person is engaged in that point, the trafficker begins to reshape the way the victim views the world. The trafficker assigns the shame, humiliation, and guilt that the victim is feeling to the way the people outside view that person. So at that point, the pimp might say things like, "Yeah, you are a slut," or "You are this, you are that," and everybody who looks at you thinks that way. So now the person is just in there feeling really bad about themselves, stuck, and they're being trafficked. And that is when it can be really hard to get them out. But there is hope. Remember the verse that we talked about at the beginning about Jesus wanting to set the captives free. So the traffickers do gain control. We talked about this a little bit. Physical control, psychological control, which is often more difficult to recognize when a person is under psychological control. They may think that the abuse and the lifestyle is normal, that they deserve it. They have a false loyalty to the pimp or to the gang. And then there's also something that can form called trauma bonds. Maybe you've heard of this before. There's a study that shows about trauma bonds, how people actually start to identify with the person who is the perpetrator, the person who's abusing them, to the point where when you separate them, they don't want to be separated because they don't know how to respond. They are bonded to this person through what's called trauma bonds. And this often happens, which is why we see the loyalty that can exist between the victim and the perpetrator. So trauma bonds are a defense mechanism that a victim will adopt in order to survive in that incredibly traumatic situation that they're in. So it's really something that they've done that shows their strength, that shows their ability to try to survive, but it's in a way that actually hurts them because they will defend the perpetrator, they will deny that they're even victims, they will have loyalty to the perpetrator as a result of these trauma bonds that happen. They'll be rationalizing it, "I deserved it," saying things like that, or "He really does love me, I'm doing this because I love him," and they'll be resistant to leave, which can make it difficult to get a person out of that situation. And having said all of that, because of saying all of that, I need to now say that it's important to recognize that LifePlan is not in a position where we can rescue people out of human trafficking. We can be aware of the signs, we can refer people, and we can do all that we can, and we can pray, but we are not an organization that can actually go in and get somebody out. We have to be very careful to practice within the scope of our services. So the reason that we're doing this module is so that you can be aware of the issue, so that you can be open to it, so that you can recognize possibilities of it, and then take the next step, which is all that we can really do, which we're going to talk about next. So some of the ways that we want to interact with trafficking victims. And I think that this is actually really good for all of our clients. Some of these things are ways that we can interact with all of our clients that come to us. And first of all, the important thing, very, very important thing to keep in mind with human trafficking is safety. Safety first, and that's your safety. Your safety and the safety of the people that are with you in the building. So if you're in a situation where you are really feeling like there's trafficking going on, you need to be able to protect yourself. That means you're not the one that's confronting the trafficker, the suspected trafficker. They're very dangerous. You don't want that. You need to keep yourself safe. So safety first. You interview the victim alone. Again, I talked about that before. This is why our pregnancy tests and STIs we separate male and female. We don't have more than one person in the room with them when we're going through that intake. So you have them in the room by themselves. And that is one of the things that will really help with keeping things safe, because then you're able to have that private conversation. And if you think the person is a victim of human trafficking and you've got red flags going on, you can ask the person about it, and you can offer the person the opportunity to call the police. You can give the person the hotline number to take with them. But it's not your role to separate that person and to make sure that person is taken out of that situation. We need to contact somebody who can handle it for us, whether it be the police, or for you, it's probably going to be going to your shift leader or to your client services director. So another thing to remember when we're interacting with trauma victims, trafficking victims, is always to interact in a trauma-informed manner. And this should be always. We should always be interacting with everybody in a trauma-informed manner. And by that, that means assuming that every person you're talking to has been a victim of trauma and not doing anything that would trigger emotional distress. So for example, I know that we are big huggers. Some of us, I'm not a big hugger, but some of us at LifePlan are big huggers. We like to hug everybody. Well, when you're talking about clients, and anybody really, ask permission first before hugging and before touching. A touch or a hug can be triggering to somebody who's been trafficked or somebody who's been a victim of abuse. So you want to keep that in mind. Also, don't get too close to clients of the opposite sex, okay? And we talk about this in our guidelines about how we should interact with volunteers of the opposite sex. But you want to make sure, guys don't go hugging girl clients, girls don't go hugging guy clients. Just don't do it. Don't get sitting real close, cozying up on a couch or a chair with them. Just give space, which is an important thing to do. Asking something called resourcing questions. These are questions like, tell me what's helping you to get through this now, or tell me about the moment you knew you survived. These help them to be able to pull up their resources that they have and their strengths and can help them to feel better in the moment. And like I said before, practice within our scope. So we have to remember our role in this. We can identify as best we can, and we can let people know that we think there's a situation. We can give the person the tools to contact if they need help. We can give them a little slip of paper that they can slip in their pocket that has a phone number that they can call. We can do those things, and those are things that we should be doing. But we need to recognize that we have to be very careful, not that we refer these people to further help instead of trying to do it ourselves, which can be difficult to say because we want to do everything. But again, scope of services is very important. I want to close right here. Oh, the last thing on that is document everything. So everything that happens, you need to document that. It needs to be in writing. And that's also something that would probably go more through your shift leader and client services director. But just so you know, if you have a situation like this is not something to go home and deal with on your own. It's something to talk to your shift leader or client services director, a staff member that's there if there's no client services director. Talk to them about, they need to be notified of this. They need to know what went on. Again, when we talked about confidentiality, it's not breaking confidentiality to talk to somebody who's in a supervisor role over you. So make sure that you are letting everybody know when you have a situation that you think is questionable so that they can tell you what to do with the next steps, because that really is your next step, is to tell a person who's your shift leader or staff member and let that person take over from there. To close, here are some things that are some ways that you can develop rapport or connection with victims and survivors in a trauma-informed manner. And I'm going to read some of these because I think it's great for all of our clients, and we'll end with this. Things to do. First of all, as I said before, remember safety first for you and for your victim. Sit, don't stand or hover. Take your time. Don't multitask. Avoid writing while the patient is talking. It's very easy for us to write down on our chart, but if they're telling us a story and you start to suspect that there's abuse or there's trauma there, it's best to just put your pencil down for a while and listen. Next thing, be empathetic, but not sympathetic. Make sure you don't appear to pity the patient. Oh, that's too bad. That's so terrible for you. No, don't look like you're pitying the person, but just share in them by really experiencing and loving them where they're at. Be understanding without showing shock or disgust. Be non-judgmental. Use same-sex staff when possible. We already do this. You don't want to have a person of the opposite sex in there with you when you're doing that. At a minimum, know the basics of the person's cultural and religious background in order to understand his worldview and not to offend them at this time. Of course, we want to bring them to Christ, but we also want to listen first in a loving manner. So try to understand where they're coming from. Let the patient lead or set the pace. Provide assurance that they're in control of what they say and what they do when they're there. Do not approach the patient as a friend. Rather, maintain your role. And I know we want to be friends, but you also need to be professional at this point too. So maintain a role as a professional when you're talking with them at first about this. Again, ask permission every time you're going to touch the client, and this is one thing that could be helpful in a trauma-informed manner, is to assure the client that law enforcement is an ally, that the police can help if they let them know and they get involved. So try to talk positively about that. Include other people, other volunteers on a need-to-know basis only. I mentioned talking to your supervisor, shift leader, and client staff members or client service director, but other volunteers, it's a need-to-know basis, only if they're going to be seeing that client. This is not something that you want to spread around to everybody. And then don't lecture the client about his or her behaviors or choices. Again, they might not have been choices. So really get to know the information first. Like when you see how many sexual partners the person has had, don't lecture them about it. Try to understand it. And you can give them information and education, but recognize that there might be some more stuff involved when you've got multiple partners going on. And then finally, we've talked about this through all of our training, never promise more than you can deliver, and always deliver on the promises that you make. So human trafficking is a big, huge topic. This is just touching the surface of it, but hopefully after listening to this, after watching this module, you feel have a little bit more knowledge about it and feel a little bit more confident in your ability to recognize and know what you're supposed to do. At this point, you're going to go and talk with your shift leader or staff member about this module. If you have any questions, any further things to discuss, there's some discussion questions you guys will have to really help you process what you just learned. So thank you, and good job getting this module done.